Hi, welcome back. We're going to switch gears a little bit. So now we're going to talk about a fault that you would see on an ISX 570, 870, 871. But you won't see it on anything newer than an 871. So if your engine was made in 2010 or newer, this wouldn't apply to you. The fault is for the fuel system, and on this engine there's two faults and they're related to each other. So I just wanted to show you the fault, show you how to check what you need to check, and then show you identify the parts. I've got a parts explosion, an illustrated parts explosion, to show you the parts that we're talking about. Okay, let's get started. So here's an explosion of the IFSM, which is basically the fuel system on an ISX CM570, 870, and 871. And up at the top on the left, you see fault codes. 254 was active with 21 counts, and 482 was inactive with 2 counts. Now, down on the bottom, I've got 2 yellow arrows, and I've got the fault code at the end of the arrow and it's pointing to the part that drove that fault code. So, for example, 482, that is pointing to the fuel pressure sensor that told the ECM that the fuel pressure was way too low. In this case, way too low for the engine to even start. And you can see that up at our description on the faults up on top for 482, it says the engine may not start, may have low power, may have white smoke, or run rough, or all of the above after it starts. The other fault, 254 on the right, you can see the arrow is pointing to the fuel solenoid, and that's an electromagnet with 1 stud on it. Some have 2 studs. If it's got 2 studs, it might be an isolated ground, and you have to have a ground wire on 1 stud. You can check that with the meter to find out if you've got that going on or not. And in this case, 254 was active on this engine, and it was because that solenoid was shorted out. So let's take a look at our checks for checking that solenoid. So these solenoids come in different flavors. They come in 12 volt. That's pretty much your automotive on the street. 24 volt, you see that on a lot of industrial stuff, but not all. Some of it's 12. There's 32 volt. The only time I saw 32 volt on the stuff that I worked on, I saw it on locomotives. They used to have some engines and locomotives, and they were all 32 volts solenoids because that was what the basic electrical voltage was on that particular locomotive. I think they also used some of the 32s on generator sets. But on the left is the part number that you would need to purchase for the 24, the 12, or the 32. And then on the right where it says coil resistance, that's what you would check with your meter. So the proper way to check it would be to loosen a nut, remove the wire completely, and then you check your one side of your meter test lead to the stud and the other side to a good grounded spot on the coil itself. So you can take some sandpaper and clean a spot off on the side of the case if you need to check that. And these are your ohm ranges that you need to be. If you're outside of these ranges, then probably you're going to need to replace that magnet. Sometimes these things will test good cold. When they get hot, the resistance will change because they'll have an internal short that shows up when they get hot and the windings swell. So I've seen situations where they test out fine cold, and then after they run for a few hours, they'll just shut down. And if you grab that magnet, usually it'll be really hot if they've got a problem going on. You can also have a 254 if something happens to the wire between the ECM and the magnet. It's the fuel solenoid. I call it a magnet because it is just an electromagnet. So I've seen loose wire ends. I've seen wire ends on the factory harness. They'll have like a ball of rubber around the joint where the wire's crimped on to the end, so to keep salt and whatnot out of it. And I've seen them break right inside that joint. And so then you think the wire's good and the wire's really not. And I've also seen where the driver and the ECM will fail. That can happen just because maybe the coil's got a problem and it's got a short and it's drawing too much current all day long. That transistor in the ECM is current protected, but they can go bad like any other electrical part. So whenever you see that 254 fault, the engine probably shut down or at least stumbled. I've seen that fault just happen after the engine runs for a few hours and that solenoid gets hot. I've seen that fault because the wire between the ECM and that solenoid has a break in it. A lot of times if there's a break in the wire, it'll be right where the wire bolts on the solenoid. The factory engine harness, they had it looked like a ball of rubber right there around the connection where they crimped the wire on that end, and I've seen the wire break inside of that ball or right where it goes into it because it tends to vibrate right there. So you can suspect a broken wire if you've got that fault. And sometimes if it's a solenoid, it'll be fine for when the engine's cold. You might run an hour, 2 or 3, and then all of a sudden it'll just shut down for no reason. You coast over, it'll start right back up and run for a few more hours. When you see that happen, change the solenoid. There's a short inside of it. It might check okay on your meter, but you need to change it. And remember, it's just an electromagnet. When you check it, the wire's got to be off of it. You saw the ohm readings. You clean up a good spot on the side, nice and clean, and you ohm between the lead and the side. Also wiggle that stud that comes out of there. If it's loose, replace it. Something's wrong. If you take the magnet off of there's 4 screws that hold it on. If you take it off, the end that bolts against the IFSM housing, it needs to be flat. It'll look like there's a dark brown a resin in there. It's real hard. That's yellow when they're new. They turn dark brown from being cooked. That resin is where the windings are. If the resin is protruding out a little bit, you need to replace it. It's swollen and the windings have moved. So those are the things you need to know with this fault. And once you get the problem fixed, you just clear the faults and you're good to go. See you next time on Engine Shop Joe.